Thanks for coming, everyone, and welcome to this group presentation from our research team on Lajos Kossuth and news transfer in the international press system. I'm Paul Fyfe from North Carolina State University, and I'll be joined by Jana Keck from the German Historical Institute, Washington, as well as Mila Oiva from Tallinn University. To start, I'll explain a bit about the framework for our research. Then Jana will introduce the data and methods. And finally, Mila will share some takeaways from our project. Slide, please. This is a case study from a larger project called Oceanic Exchanges, tracing global information networks in historical newspaper repositories 1840 to 1914, or OCX for short. It's run by PIs at Northeastern University, Ryan Cordell from English and David Smith from Computer Science, and it involves teams from 6 different countries: Mexico, Finland, the US, Britain, the Netherlands, and Germany. Each team is exploring digital newspaper collections from their national libraries. They're also pooling these collections into a massive data set that we can explore together as a whole, searching for patterns. Oceanic Exchanges started from another project called Viral Texts, which basically used plagiarism detection software to find reprinted articles in 19th century US newspapers. The difference is, Oceanic Exchanges looked across national newspaper collections and even across languages to study the global circulation of printed news in the 19th century. What kind of news travels? Where does it go? At what speeds? How do those patterns change over time, or with differing contents, or in different places? And what might that tell us about the emergence of a global information network 100 years before the internet? Slide, please. Among the various case studies in OCX, ours looked at Lajos Kossuth. Kossuth was an international phenomenon in the mid-19th century. He came to prominence during the European revolutions of 1848 as he tried to liberate Hungary from the Austrian Empire. The empire suppressed the revolution with little help from Russia, and Kossuth fled for his life. From that point on, he started traveling to drum up support for Hungarian independence, and he got a lot of attention. Kossuth was noted as a brilliant orator and spoke several languages, which let him address different national audiences directly. But Kossuth became a global celebrity thanks to an internationalizing network of printed newspapers. Slide, please. As Kossuth traveled internationally, news about him was traveling too. Our research zeroes in on one particular trip. In December of 1851, Kossuth landed in New York City at the outset of his campaign to secure American support. His trip along the eastern seaboard, ultimately arriving in Washington, D.C., was exhaustively covered by the American press, and then refracted through the international newspapers who realized the political significance of Kossuth's appeal. Everyone wanted to know whether the U.S. government would take action in the international arena on behalf of other countries. Doing so would have reaching diplomatic implications and effectively shift the balance of global power. Thus, the official U.S. response to Kossuth's visit was primed to be big news everywhere. Slide, please. Because of this shared attention, Kossuth helps us examine international news as a media system. Firstly, texts about this event diffused widely, illuminating the reach of news like a barium injection under X-ray. Secondly, the distribution of these reports, as well as how they mutate or disappear, can reveal the topography of 19th century newspapers. Within our corpus of various national collections, we wanted to find out, where does this news go? What kinds of stories propagated? How did they change in different places or in different languages? Why does some news not travel? And ultimately, what do these patterns and anomalies tell us about the workings of an internationalizing press system? Jana?
Thank you, Paul. So our sources span historic newspaper collections by 10 data partners from Europe and the Americas. The entire corpus comprises several languages, but of course the data set provides only a partial view to examine global discussions. Moreover, it is biased since the English language makes up the majority of newspaper articles. Therefore, we do not pretend to comprehensiveness, but find in the case study on Kossuth a sufficiently international phenomenon to warrant further explanation. So why Kossuth? As Paul already mentioned, in the 19th century, without substantial copyright enforcement, texts circulated promiscuously through the newspaper print market and were often revised by editors during the process. We use algorithms for detecting clusters of reused passages embedded within newspaper issues in our Oceanic Exchanges collection. We apply these techniques to analyze the culture of reprinting across nations, languages, and decades. So basically, the program, which is called PASM software, looks into each document that is a newspaper issue and remembers character sequences. And if there are similar sequences, it puts these textual snippets from different documents into, so to speak, into clusters. In terms of high amounts of reprint clusters, Kossuth in general, but especially his arrival in the US prompted an explosion of coverage, signaling the highest level of reprint activity within our collections. As you can see in the histogram below the geographical map, his trip far exceeded his mentions during the Hungarian Revolution in 1858 and 59, his trip to Britain in 1851, or later the news of his death in 1894. To help take a closer look, we also created a smaller corpus to investigate the news coverage of the arrival and extracted all articles within 7 days. The smaller corpus comprises 668 articles from December 6, 1851, first hits in the US, to January 5, 1852, last hits of 7-day period in Finland. The smaller dataset was integrated into an interactive visualization tool, LilyPads, as you can see on the slide, which we developed in the Oceanic Exchanges project to analyze the textual, temporal, and geographic dissemination of news articles. So instead of reading all news articles in a spreadsheet, we used LilyPads to interactively click on specific dates or locations to read the articles consequently. Comparing the two data sets, all reprint clusters on Kossuth from 1840 to 1914, and the smaller data set covering December 1851 and January 1852, allows us to study the event's international media representation and simultaneously to zoom into news coverage directly preceding and following this event. So we are especially interested in what news propagated across our corpus, whether by reprints, translation, adaptation, or otherwise. And so now Mila will show you some of our findings.
All right. Thank you, Jana. Okay, next slide, please. So what did we actually find out when we started to study Lajos Kossuth news and about his trip in the US with these methods that Jana just described you? Here is another visualization that really shows that actually Kossuth news really peaked around his travel to the US and right after that. And as we looked at these, both of these kind of like this larger data set and the more specific smaller corpus, we realized that how different countries discussed Lajos Kossuth news in a little bit different ways. Next slide, please. So one of the very first news about Lajos Kossuth was like what we call the 31 gunshots about that of reception of Kossuth in the US. This was a news piece that traveled in a similar manner to many countries, from the US to England and to Germany and to even to Finland. And there were not many changes in this news. The only things that we could see that kind of like made these little different nuances of this news were that in the American newspapers, they discussed Kossuth as the illustrious Hungarian liberator, or Governor Kossuth, like in a very pompous manner, you could say. While in European newspapers, Kossuth was simply referred to as Kossuth. So here we can already see within this small news piece that in different continents and different countries, the construction of Lajos Kossuth's public image was a little bit different. Next slide, please. Okay, so Lajos Kossuth was actually a former newspaper editor, so he knew very well how to use press to construct favorable public opinion that would support his cause and the Hungarian cause. So that's why he distributed copies of his speeches to newspapers to make sure that they would have the right version of his speeches. And he also monitored very closely what was being said about him and his cause in the press. We can see that there were also other forces in this kind of like in this information space, if you would say. The Austrian government and most of all the Austrian chargé d'affaires in Washington D.C., Johann Georg Hülsemann, was writing public letters in order to undermine Kossuth's mission. For instance, he wrote about that there would appear in the U.S. Black Kossuth, and connected the Kossuth case to the debate over slavery in the U.S. Of course, creating dividing opinions in that realm. Next slide, please. We could also detect certain kinds of misinformation and news gaps in the Kossuth news. There were, for instance, fake news circulating about alleged Kossuth mother's death. There were also absences of news. For instance, in the Grand Duchy of Finland, the Finnish language newspapers could not talk about Kossuth at all because of the censorship that was in force there. The Swedish language newspapers in Finland could cover the topic because they were directed to more upper classes. But we can see that there were also discussions about this like misinformation in the newspapers in Europe, for instance, and that the contemporary news reporters understood that the increasing information landscape of the global newspapers was increasingly connected and politicized. Next slide, please. At the end of his visit to the U.S., it became clear that the U.S. government was not going to support officially Lajos Kossuth's mission or give him any official support. So that's why, in the end, he announced in the press that his mission was failed. And it seems that he did that because in order to generate more material and moral support from the public. We could see that the U.S. newspapers reacted to this by stating that the president or the government did not represent the public opinion, which was really supportive to Kossuth. While when this news traveled to Europe, many European newspapers took this as a face value and simply stated that the mission was failed, also undermining his cause. Next slide, please. In conclusion, we can say that already in 1850s, there could be a global topic in the news, and the same news could travel all around the world. However, we could also see that the meaning of the news was interpreted in different manner in different locations, depending, of course, of the political and cultural context. Thus, we could say that news was simultaneously an international and domesticated phenomenon. I think that's what we wanted to say, and thank you.